Inviting me back, and good to see all of you. And we're ready for the book of Exodus, right? So here we go. Let's welcome everyone. There you go. And actually, maybe you already know that a lot of what I'll be talking about is in a published book. I just happen to bring it with me. Usually, most of my publishing and the books that I write are for pastors, kind of a more scholarly audience. I have 3 children who live in Fort Collins, Colorado, and they said, "We don't like those books, Dad. We don't understand it." So I've tried a few books along these lines. I did one on Jeremiah, Overcoming Life's Sorrows, and this is my second one on a more popular level. Deliver Us, God's Rescue Story in Exodus. I dedicated my Jeremiah book to my 3 children, and I dedicated this book to one of my granddaughters, Mara Rose Eaton. It says, "May you always dance to the music." This is my story, this is my song. So anyway, if you're interested in diving deeper in Exodus, there's your book. There's your book. Here's what we're going to do for the next 9 weeks, right? 9 weeks. We're going to look at the book of Exodus under this wonderful hymn that we just sang. This is our story, this is our song. Now, you've probably known that song since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, right? Maybe in Sunday school or Vacation Bible School. I mean, it's a wonderful 19th century song. When I was working on this book, I started working on it about 2 years ago, again, off and on, more off than on. And it dawned upon me, I was actually in the airport in Denver, Colorado. I just visited my 3 children and their families. I was sitting there working on my book, and it just dawned upon me that this is what the book of Exodus is about. This is our story, this is our song. So how are we going to take a look at all of this? First of all, what God did, God still does. That's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to do an overview of the book a little bit, talk about how this is our story. Then I guess I can look up here. I've got a ticket to ride. So we're going to bring in Paul and George and John and Ringo. All right. We got a ticket to ride. Well, maybe you know the Beatles. I'm sure you do. So what's all that about? Well, that's talking a little bit more about the book of Exodus, and that's really the second half of my first chapter. So we're going to do a couple of weeks talking about how the book of Exodus interfaces and interacts with our lives, our story. So once we set the foundation there, then we're going to look at big things with small stuff. I really like that because I often tell people I'm 5'9", but I'm not 5'9", I'm 5'8.5", and shrinking, all right? So I like the big things with small stuff, all right? That would be Moses, right, in a little ark that's in the Nile River that starts everything, really. Second half of Exodus chapter 2. And then we get to Exodus chapter 3, modified Moses and us. That's the burning bush. Chapter 3, the heart of the problem. Then we're going to look at Pharaoh, right? And his hard heart. 10 times, it says, during the plagues, right? There's 10 plagues, and 10 times it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. 10 times it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So we want to take a look at that, along with the plagues. Oh my gosh, the plagues. What's your favorite plague? Mine is the frogs, okay? It's my favorite part in my book. I'll save that for the heart of the problem. Then we look at Passover peace. The Passover, right? This is a big Jewish festival. This is the night that Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. So we're in Exodus chapter 12 there. The plagues really begin in chapter 8, all right, and go through chapter 11. So then we get to chapter 12. Then we walk by faith, not by sight. That's going through the Red Sea, on dry land. Provision for our problems. Well, once we leave Egypt, slavery, and then, and I say we, that's intentional. This is our story. We leave slavery, we go through the water, and we don't make the promised land initially. Oh no, there's a detour. We have to go through the wilderness, God provides for our problems in the wilderness. And then we make it to Mount Sinai in chapter 19, and that would be where we begin to understand on Mount Sinai that we become what we worship. We become what we worship, either for our ruin and destruction or for our restoration and salvation. And that's chapter 32. All right, the golden calf, you know that story, right? It's a 40-chapter book, right? So there's a lot of stuff, and I think I've picked up the highlights there. There's a whole lot more that we'll touch on, but that's what we're going to look at. So 9 titles, 9 weeks. This is our story. This is our song. Isn't this a beautiful painting, right? This is our story. And then the song, we'll talk about the song. Israel's first song, all right, is in chapter 15 of Exodus 1 through 18. Okay, so here we go. This is the topic tonight. God, what God did, God still does. All right? What God did, God still does. He still splits the sea. He still leads his people. And this is our story. And this is our song. What a story. What a story. As Susan said, I'm really a part-time pastor in Egan, and I live in St. Paul. So when I cross the Mississippi River, at least coming back from Egan, there is a big sign for a casino. I think it's the Mystic Lake Casino, all right? And it says, "Your story begins here." It's interesting. Anybody seen that around town? Your story begins here. Yeah. I've got a theological word for that. Take notes. Some of you are taking notes, right? Baloney, right? Our story does not start making money at casinos, right? Well, of course. Where does our story start? Our story, the biblical story in which we are a part of, which is a major theme, right, of these 9 weeks, it starts in the book of Exodus, okay? So there's another wonderful painting, all right, of Israelites going through the Red Sea. As I think about the idea of story, that's a pretty big metaphor these days, right? Not only Fanny Crosby singing, "This is our story, this is our song," but people talk a lot about story. I was thinking, what is synonymous with story? And it would be life, right? We often talk about our life, right? What's the difference between saying, "Let me tell you about my life," and "Let me tell you about my story"? Well, there's some similarities, no doubt. But there's some very important differences. A story involves characters and ups and downs and highs and lows. A story implies movement. A story implies a beginning and an end. So it's quite a story. It's quite a story. The book of Exodus has 2 titles. 2 titles. So we'll just kind of start talking about the story. We know it as Exodus, right? That's kind of the Greek and then the English title of the book. Ex means like leave. You can just kind of see the Greek right up there, right? There's 3 Greek words here. Ex. Ex means out, exit, right? So we get that. And Haddas means what? Haddas means what? So the ancient Greeks who translated the Hebrew of the book of Exodus into the Greek Exodus, they said, we're going to call it Exodus. The way out. Way out of what? Way out a whole lot of misery and slavery and bricks. All kinds of bricks. And Pharaoh with his bricks and his tricks and his endless, here it comes, whips. All right. So Exodus, right? It's the way out. It's the way out, right? The way out of Egypt, out of Egypt. The Hebrews didn't call it Exodus, all right? The Old Testament, obviously written in Hebrew initially, they call it Ve'ela Shemot. Ve'ela Shemot. There's actually three words. And Ve'ela, these Shemot names. And these are the names. So if you're talking to a Jewish person, you say, we're studying the book of Exodus. They'll probably look like, huh? Oh, they'll probably know. But if you say, we're looking at Ve'ela Shemot, they'll say, hallelujah. All right? Yeah. These are the names. These are the names. So both titles, Exodus, the way out, these are the names. They both tell us something about the book, about the story. I prefer the Hebrew title since I teach Hebrew and like Hebrew, and sometimes I dream in Hebrew. Ve'ela Shemot. These are the names. And these are the names. The and implies there's a connection with Genesis. So we'll be talking a lot about Genesis. That's the backstory. Everybody's got a backstory to their story. What's your backstory? Well, my mom and dad, my mom was born in St. Paul. She really was. My dad was born in Denver, Colorado. My mom's family moved from St. Paul to Denver in 1944. That's the whole backstory. And then I could talk about their parents and then their parents. That's about as far as I can go. But everybody's got a backstory, right? So what's the backstory to the book of Exodus? Genesis. Genesis, the backstory. So that's and. It's a continuation of a story, right? That's what and means. And this, and that. And then these are the names. Names. Names are so important in the book of Exodus, especially God's name. I was here last year. We talked a little bit about God's name. So we'll do that along the way. But what a story. What a story. How many of you remember, or you've probably seen, the 1956 movie Cecil B. DeMille, The Ten Commandments? Anybody raise a hand? Yeah, you have. The star would be Charlton Heston, right? Gosh, all of you. That's good. If I would ask that of my students at Concordia University, they just go, so I'm 63 years old, and bless you. All of my cultural jokes and all of my cultural moorings and markers, no one gets at the university. I'm glad I'm with a friendly group here. Who played the Pharaoh? Anybody remember that? Yul Brynner. Remember that? So let it be written, so let it be done. And that sounds so biblical, but it's not in the Bible, all right? I used to tell my children that. So let it be written, so let it be done. Yeah. And they said, that's not in the Bible, Dad, so don't try it anymore. All right. It's a great story. Cecil B. DeMille realized that. Generation later in 1996, Steven Spielberg and David Geffen of DreamWorks also realized Exodus is a sure bet. So they created an animated movie called what? The Prince of Egypt. Egypt, without a doubt. Exodus is one of the world's greatest books. It really is. It's great literature, it's great history, it's great faith, right? There's a burning bush, there's 10 plagues, there's 10 commandments, there's 10 times they use the word L-O-R-D in all caps in their song. Yahweh, they talk about Yahweh, they sing of him 10 times in Exodus 15, 1 through 18, and of course God hardens Pharaoh's heart 10 times, and Pharaoh hardens his own heart 10 times. So the book likes what number? 10, because we know the 10 Commandments, but there's a few more 10s, right? There's the Passover, the Red Sea, the manna. What does manna mean? What is it? What is it? That's the Hebrew. I'm being serious. All right, so next time you say, oh, this tastes like manna, and someone knows Hebrew, you're done. All right? And you're saying, what the heck is this? Right. We have the golden calf, the tabernacle, and then, of course, there's Moses. And primarily, there would be Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who brings people into the Exodus story. We have a story, right? We all have a story. We begin telling stories when we're small children, right? Well, this happened, then that happened, then by golly, that happened. As we grow up, our parents kind of help us fill in the blanks, right? I remember when I was like in high school, I often wondered what happened to Uncle Bob. Oh, well, he was killed in World War II. I didn't know that. I didn't have Uncle killed in World War II, right? What happened to Aunt Marilyn? Oh, she got remarried, had 3 children. I didn't know that. I didn't know she had like a divorce and got remarried. So you know how that goes. As you grow up, your parents help you add to your story. And by the time you're 18 years old, you know everything, right? Well, not quite, not quite. A parent's first words to a crying child who comes running to her are often what? What happened? Tell me your story. See, tell me your story. It's healthy to put terrifying experiences into stories as a way to process it, right? Conversely, it's catastrophic when we can't verbalize our story. Now, I'm going to tell you about that, all right? It took me a long time to talk about my story. A wordless past implies a hopeless future. I've got to be able to write, maybe not write, but tell my story, which means I need to own my story. I like to own the parts of my story that are successful and bright and beautiful and make me look good. I don't like the part of the story where I'm the villain and the guy in the black hat and there's a pain and brokenness and baggage and massive disappointment. But part of our time together is learning how to own our own story. Because if I don't own my own story, how can I be part of another story? I want to learn how to tell my story within the Exodus story. What's the dominant story of our lives today? I put this slide up here. It's Ecclesiastes. It's kind of a downer of a book, right? It talks a lot about how life is meaningless under the sun. All right? A meaningless story means a meaningless life. Kind of chasing after the wind. So having just once witnessed the birth of a child, and I witnessed that 3 times, imagine that you are in the hospital and you witness the birth of your first child. You're ecstatic as new parents. The next day an attorney steps into the maternity room, puts down his briefcase, takes out a document, and begins reading it to the newborn child. Clearing his throat, the attorney warns, "Be advised that human life is difficult and in all cases ends in death. Some people reported experiences with lethal viruses, esophageal cancer, and jihadist terrorists. Birth can also result in fatal encounters with tsunamis, drunk drivers, and nuclear disasters. Side effects of living include dental cavities, migraine headaches, and backed up traffic on interstate highways. Welcome to the post-umbilical cord world." That's the story. That's the story, right? It's just a series of setbacks, some gains, a lot of losses. You begin at the cradle, you end the casket. Many would say, yep, that's it. You got it right. Life is a cosmic accident. We're here by chance. Have fun. Do it soon. When you die, that's it forever. The sober scenario continues. When you die, you lose everything to the next generation. Your children will rent out your house, purge your possessions, spend their inheritance wining and dining on the French Riviera. You'll become a distant memory at Thanksgiving meals and then be forgotten altogether. For a lot of people, that's their story. It's their story. It's kind of like the book of Ecclesiastes, chasing the wind, chasing the wind. Is that the only story? Can that be true? Is that all there is? Sometimes we think so. How many of you have seen this movie? Groundhog Day, all right. television weatherman is on location Puxtawanny, Pennsylvania, relives Groundhog Day day after day. His story never changes. We know that feeling, right? The story never changes. It's just the same stuff, different day, right? How's your day? SSDD, same stuff, different day. Another time around the circle. So, can we add to the story? Improvisational actors and actresses employ the phrase yes and. Maybe you've seen this, right? The goal is to keep the story going, which means neither negating nor agreeing with past statements, but adding something new that moves the story forward. This is big. I was in Denver, this in March of 2021, and I thought, this is the book of Exodus. See, and this is how God treats our stories. See, when we're thinking about our stories, God doesn't say, well, yeah, but, or God doesn't interrupt and say, no, you got it wrong. No, it's yes. God affirms the good, the bad, and the ugly in our stories. But then he uses the word and. Yes, and. Yes, and. All right? This is the book of Exodus. Moses invites us, all right, to amend, correct, and add to our story through his story, the Exodus story. This is our story, this is our song, right? The genius of the book is that God places us into its grand narrative. He wants to say yes and. Yes, I experienced a traumatic childhood. Yes, I have deep insecurity. Yes, I wrestle with a lack of self-worth and fear of failure. And all this is actually me, all right? It really is. And God has rescued me from my past, brought me out of bondage to sin through holy baptism, and now leads me to the promised land. Yes, and. Yes, and. Our story doesn't need to stay stuck in perpetual pain. Our story doesn't have to be circular and marked with misery and despair. We certainly don't have to keep letting others write our own story. Anybody have that problem? Well, let me tell you who you are and what happened. Oh, no. Don't let other people write your story, right? God is the one who writes our story. And this is a story of redemption and freedom from Egypt. God invites us to look at our well-rehearsed stories, adding to these stories his gifts of redemption and new life. But you know what? I need to warn you. It takes spine to tamper with and edit our story. It's easier just to kind of stay stuck, right? Groundhog's Day, right? It's easier to let sleeping dogs lie. It's easier just to stay with the same sorry, sometimes very sick story. But that's not what the book of Exodus tells us about. Paul and Rabbi Gamaliel. We are told by St. Paul when he's arrested in Jerusalem, and Acts chapter 22 narrates the arrest. And Paul gets up and he says, I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia, modern-day Turkey, but I was nurtured and educated by Gamaliel in Jerusalem. Why do I say that? Because Gamaliel he's a famous first century Jewish rabbi. All right, we know a lot about Rabbi Gamaliel. We know what he wrote. All right. So this is what Rabbi Gamaliel says. Quote, in the Mishnah Pesakim, that's an ancient Jewish writing. Quote, in every generation, a person must so regard themselves as if they themselves came forth out of Egypt. So I'll just say that again. In every generation, a person must so regard themselves as if they themselves came forth out of Egypt. And his text from the Bible, you can open this up now, in Psalm 66. The book of Psalms has a lot to say about the Exodus and the book of Exodus and Israel's whole experience through this. In fact, in my book on Exodus, I begin each chapter with a quote from the book of Psalms, because it's just all over the place. Now, different psalm writers in the Psalter talk about the Exodus. So if you're looking at Psalm 66, verse 6, all right? So you're reading along, it says, he turned the sea into dry land. Got it, check, right? They passed through the river on foot. Yeah, check, they did. There did, I'm reading from the ESV, we rejoice in him. Now that we comes like a bolt of lightning. That we comes out of, no, what do you mean we? We, who wrote this psalm? Anyway, we're not told. But we know it's a long time after the book of Exodus. We. Rabbi Gamaliel takes the we literally. Literally. We, every subsequent generation came out of Egypt. We went through the Red Sea as on dry land. He goes on. This is Rabbi Gamaliel. Therefore, we are obligated to thank, praise, glorify, extol, exalt, honor, bless, revere, laud. Lots of words there. The one who performed for our forefathers and for us all these miracles. He took us out of slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to a great light, and from enslavement to redemption. All of which means, if we're going to actually apply this, we need to use our imagination. Imagination. In our inner life. Imagination. I want to talk about that a little bit. We normally, and rightfully so, think of the Christian life as a lot of stuff in our mind, right? Which is good. But God also wants to engage our imagination. Imagination. If you look at this verse up here, it's Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. So how do we make the Exodus story our story? See, I mean, it's one thing for me to get up and kind of quote Bible verses and Rabbi Gamaliel and look at Psalm 66, verse 5. There did we rejoice in him. But how does this actually work in my life? I need imagination. All right? So this is what Genesis 6:5 says. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every imagination of his heart was only evil continually. What has happened to our ability to imagine things? It's been corrupted into fantasy. So I want to make a big distinction, demarcation between imagination and fantasy. Fantasy is thinking about stuff that will never happen. Like the Minnesota Vikings winning a Super Bowl. All right. I just had to say, although we beat the Packers, isn't that great? Yeah. But don't get your hopes up, right? But fantasy is stuff that'll never happen. All right? When I was a little kid, I wanted to play second base for the St. Louis Cardinals. That's fantasy. Fantasy. I mean, I tried. I played baseball in college, but that was it. All right? Fantasy is dwelling on stuff that never happens. Imagination, sanctified, Holy Spirit, Christian imagination, is putting ourselves into the Exodus story. So what does that look like? It looks like this. What enemy is chasing you right now? What enemy is chasing you right now? One of my biggest fears is the fear of abandonment. Abandonment. That they're all going to leave me finally. All right? Sometimes I see that in my rearview mirror. Sometimes I see a flashing red light in my rearview mirror, but that's for another time. what are those enemies, right? Usually it's a fear of something, right? Fear of abandonment, fear of sickness, gosh, inflation is up, the stock market keeps going down, right? Financial fears. All of those are chasing us and want to overtake us and bring us back into that bondage. Imagination says what? You know what's going to happen to all those enemies chasing me? God's going to drown them in the Red Sea, and I'm going to escape from Egypt. That's imagination. This is what Moses is doing here. You can look at Hebrews chapter 11, which is a great section on Moses, at least this kind of middle third of Hebrews 11. Verse 27, it says here, by faith, Hebrews 11:27, he, this is Moses, Charlton Heston, right? Not being afraid of the anger of the king, that would be the Pharaoh, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. That's imagination. You see God at work, even though it's all invisible. It's all in your inner mind and heart and attitude. So you see God at work, although you see him who is invisible. Invisible. God wants us to develop our imagination, not fantasy. All right, fantasy this isn't real. This is very real, because this is our story, and we're in the story. All right, all the enemies chasing us are defeated. We don't have to live in bondage in Egypt any longer. I just don't get that in my head, like, oh well, yeah, I believe the Bible. I get it in my imagination. My imagination. Then I'm reading like something, John 8:36, where Jesus says, if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. And now I have this whole story about freedom. Freedom. Because God has brought me through the Red Sea as on dry land. Let's take a look at how the book is structured so we make the story our story. Here's some verses up here for us. Exodus chapter 12, verse 27. This is in the Passover liturgy and ceremony, the Passover lamb, the bitter herbs, right, the unleavened bread, all of that we'll take a look at. But within this, you can see that in verse 26 of chapter 12, your children may ask you, what do you mean by this service? Why are we going to church, Dad? See, why are you dragging me to vacation Bible school? Why have to go to confirmation? I mean, that kind of stuff. Verse 27, you shall say it is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared, here comes, bolt from lightning, right? I felt the earth move under my feet. What's he say? Our houses. Our houses. Just like we rejoiced there in the Red Sea when we saw the enemies going down like a dead man's float, if you know that song. Our houses. Look at chapter 13. Just the verses are up there. Chapter 13, verse 8. Again, it's talking, parents teaching children. Exodus 13:8. You shall tell your son on that day, this is the day of the unleavened bread, you can see that, verse 7. It is because of what the Lord did for, here comes another bolt out of the blue. What's the word there? Me. Me. Now, you see what's happening here is that what God did, God still does. That's the theme of the study tonight. What God did, God still does. So every generation in Israel, and all of us can say what? What? In verse 8, You shall tell your son on that day is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So Moses writes this book. So 400 years later, you're reading, oh, this is my story. I can imagine this. Look at this painting, right? That's freedom. Freedom. Freedom from Egypt. What's life like in Egypt? We'll look at that a lot next week. Okay, so then we have verse 14. Verse 14 in chapter 13. And when in time to come, your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. And then you scroll down to verse 16. It's up there in Exodus 13. It shall be as a mark on your hand and frontlets between your eyes. All right, these phylacteries is what they are. You can still see them on, Orthodox Jewish men. All right. For by a strong hand the Lord brought us. So we are, to coin a term, we are exodized. All right. When we're baptized, we're exodized. There's the water. There's the word. There's the power. God still is in the business of calling people out of Egypt. Out of Egypt. We're exodized. This is what Paul teaches in Romans chapter 6. Take a look. And we wonder, where did Paul get these ideas? Rabbi Gamaliel. Where did Rabbi Gamaliel get these ideas? The book of Exodus. Okay? Look at Romans chapter 6. Paul says in verse 3, do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? You mean when Jesus died, my old life died? I mean, that story is my story? Paul says, you bet. All right? Look in verse 4. When we were buried, therefore, with him by baptism, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. We participate in the Jesus story, just as we participate in the Exodus story. Look at verse 5. We've been united with him in a death like his. We shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. So baptism forgives the past. It empowers life today. And then, of course, we will be united with him in a resurrection like his. So where does Paul get these ideas that the Jesus story is my story? Through baptism. My old Adam, my old Eve is dead. I'm now walking in the power of the Spirit, new life, and I'm going to be raised just as Jesus was raised. Paul gets these ideas from Rabbi Gamaliel, who, as I said, got them from the book of Exodus. So here it is. What God did, God still does. It's for us, me. He brought me out. He brought you out. He brought us out. We rejoiced. We rejoiced. Let me tell you about a little bit about Denver, Colorado. That's where I was born and raised, I told you. My mom moved from St. Paul, met my dad in East Denver High School. They were married in 1948. And like any family, it was a mixed bag. Mixed bag. Good and bad, right? Good and bad. I'll be telling you more about my story in Denver. But suffice it to say, it's taken me a long time to own this story. Long time. Both of my parents were alcoholics. They're both deceased. They were good parents. They were not abusive physically. My dad was my Little League baseball coach. But they had a lot of problems that they inherited from their parents, and you know how that goes. I'm not blaming them. I'm just calling it as it is. It's been a long journey for me to own that story. I don't like to tell the story. I wish I could tell you that like it was the Brady Bunch or something like that. Oh, you know, it's just wonderful. There are good times. There are some pretty painful times. What I have done over the years, and I'll close with this, it's in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. So take a look at that. Hosea 11, verse 1. And Hosea, likes the book of Exodus, just like about every other author of the Bible. Hosea might take you a couple years to find it, but that's okay. All right. And I always look in your table of contents. I remember I was riding my bike in Colorado a couple years ago, visiting my children in Fort Collins. And this verse came to mind as I was kind of processing, life in Denver with Bob and Bev Lessing, my older sister, Luann. And this verse has become very precious to me. I think you'll understand. Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. All right. My imagination tells me that when I was a child trying to navigate alcoholic parents and emotional distancing and just trying to survive as a little kid, right? God loved me there, just as he loved his son Israel, right? The Israelites when they were in Egypt. When Israel was a child, I loved. Out of Egypt, I called my son. God called me out of that sick family. He just did. He just did. I don't know why I went to college in Winfield, Kansas, and decided to become a pastor. I mean, I could tell you all kinds of stories. But in retrospect, God loved me when I was in a very sorry story, and he placed me into a story of redemption. And he's done the same for you. I know we all have stories, right? But this is my story. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. We no longer live in Egypt. How do we know? I'll tell you how we know. What God did, God still does. That's it for tonight. I've gone a couple minutes over. I apologize for that. We'll do our break here. As soon as it's said, then we'll come back. We'll do some Q&A. And next week, right, we're going to talk a little bit more about having a ticket to ride.